The airport was louder than usual that evening. People hurried across the wide terminal floor, pulling rolling suitcases behind them. Some travelers stood in long lines near coffee shops, while others watched the departure screens with tired eyes. Overhead speakers repeated the same announcements again and again, reminding passengers about boarding times and delayed flights. Near Gate 27, most of the seats were already full. Families talked quietly. Business travelers typed on their laptops. A few children played with small toys on the floor, while their parents tried to keep them from wandering too far. But in the middle of all that movement and noise, one man sat very still. He looked to be in his late 30s. His clothes were simple, dark jeans, a plain jacket, and comfortable shoes that had clearly seen many long days. Nothing about him stood out. If someone walked past him quickly, they probably wouldn't notice him at all. Beside him, a small girl leaned against his shoulder, half asleep. She held a stuffed rabbit in her arms, its ears bent from years of love. Every few minutes she shifted slightly, and the man gently adjusted his arm, so her head stayed comfortable. In his other hand, he held a book. It was not a new book. The cover looked faded and soft from years of use. A small white label on the spine showed that it belonged to a library. The edges of the pages were slightly yellow, and several corners were folded. The title printed across the front read, "The Quiet Harbor." The man read slowly, turning each page with careful fingers. Sometimes he paused for a moment, as if thinking about what he had just read. Then he continued. Around him, nearly everyone else was staring at a phone or tablet. Screens glowed in the dim airport lighting. People scrolled through news, watched short videos, or answered messages. But the quiet man kept reading his book. The small girl stirred again and rubbed her eyes. "Are we on the airplane yet?" she asked in a sleepy voice. "Not yet," the man said gently. "Soon. Soon." She nodded and rested her head back against him. Within seconds, her breathing became slow and steady again. The man glanced at the large window beside the gate. Outside, planes moved slowly along the runway like giant shadows under bright airport lights. One aircraft lifted into the dark sky, its engines rumbling through the glass. He watched it disappear into the clouds, then looked back at his book. A few rows away, several flight crew members walked through the terminal together. Their uniforms were neat and sharp, their movements confident and quick. Among them was the pilot assigned to the flight at Gate 27. She carried herself with the relaxed confidence of someone who had spent many years flying. Her uniform jacket was perfectly pressed, and the silver stripes on her shoulders caught the light as she walked. She spoke casually with one of the flight attendants while they reviewed something on a tablet. As they approached the gate area, her eyes moved across the waiting passengers the way pilots often do, quietly observing the people who would soon be sitting behind them in the sky. That was when she noticed the quiet man. At first, nothing about him seemed unusual, just another tired parent traveling with a child. But the book in his hands caught her attention. She slowed her steps slightly and looked again. A library book. At an airport. She gave a small, amused smile. "Look at that," she said quietly to the flight attendant walking beside her. The attendant followed her gaze. The quiet man turned another page. "He's reading a library book," the pilot said. The attendant shrugged lightly. "People still read books." "Yes, but a library book?" the pilot said with a small laugh. "An airport?" She shook her head as if she had discovered something strangely old-fashioned. The attendant smiled politely, but didn't say much more. The pilot paused near the seating area, still looking toward the man. He seemed completely unaware of the world around him, or maybe he simply didn't care. The child resting beside him looked peaceful, and he kept one protective arm around her while reading. Something about the calm scene felt almost unusual in the busy terminal. Still curious, the pilot walked a few steps closer. She stopped beside the row of chairs where he sat. "Excuse me," she said casually. The man looked up. His expression was calm and polite. "Yes." She pointed lightly toward the book in his hands. "Do people still bring library books at airports?" she asked with a playful tone. Her voice wasn't cruel, but there was a hint of teasing in it. The man looked down at the book for a moment. Then he closed it gently, placing one finger between the pages to hold his place. A small smile appeared on his face. Some books are worth carrying everywhere, he said quietly. The answer was simple. Calm, not defensive, not embarrassed, just honest. For a moment, the pilot didn't respond. She had expected something different, maybe an awkward laugh or a quick explanation. Instead, the quiet man looked completely comfortable. The child beside him shifted again, and he carefully adjusted the stuffed rabbit in her arms. The pilot glanced at the book cover. "The Quiet Harbor," she read aloud. She nodded slightly, though she didn't say anything else about it. "Well," she said after a moment, "enjoy your reading." "Thank you," the man replied. She walked back toward the gate counter where the rest of the crew had gathered. The flight attendant leaned closer. "What was that about?" she asked. "Nothing," the pilot said. "Just a library book." But as she spoke, something in her mind felt strangely familiar. The title, The Quiet Harbor. She had heard it somewhere before. She couldn't remember exactly where. Maybe during training years ago. Or maybe in some leadership seminar she once attended. She shook the thought away. There were more important things to focus on before flight. Passengers began forming a boarding line near the gate desk. People checked their boarding passes and gathered their bags. Across the waiting area, the quiet man gently woke the small girl. "Hey," he whispered softly. Her eyes opened slowly. "Is it time?" "Yes, we're getting on the airplane now." She smiled sleepily and hugged the stuffed rabbit closer. The man slipped a thin paper bookmark into the library book and closed it again. For a brief moment, the pilot looked back toward the seating area. The man was helping his daughter stand. The old book rested under his arm. Something about the title still tugged at her memory, but the boarding process had already begun, and her attention quickly returned to the responsibilities of the flight. Passengers began moving toward the aircraft one by one. The quiet father and his daughter waited patiently near the end of the line. He held her small hand while carrying their single travel bag over his shoulder. The library book remained tucked safely beneath his arm. As the line slowly moved forward, the pilot stood near the cockpit entrance greeting passengers as they boarded. Most travelers passed quickly, offering brief smiles or quiet greetings. Then the quiet father and his daughter stepped through the aircraft door. For a moment, the pilot recognized him from the gate. He nodded politely as he passed. "Good evening," he said. "Good evening," she replied automatically. The small girl waved shyly. The man smiled and guided her down the aisle. But as he walked past, the pilot's eyes briefly caught the title on the worn book cover again. The Quiet Harbor. This time the memory stirred a little stronger. Not just a book, something more. But the moment passed quickly as more passengers stepped onto the plane. The quiet father and his daughter disappeared into the cabin, and the old library book went with them. Passengers continued boarding the aircraft in a slow and steady line. Suitcases rolled along the aisle, overhead bins opened and closed, and the quiet noise of travelers settling into their seats filled the cabin. At the front of the plane, the pilot stood near the cockpit door greeting people as they entered. It was something she had done thousands of times before. Most passengers simply nodded, offered a quick hello, and continued walking to their seats. But even while she greeted them, a small part of her mind kept returning to the same thought. The Quiet Harbor. The title felt strangely familiar. She tried to focus on the present moment. There were still passengers boarding, and the crew needed to finish preparations for departure. A flight attendant stepped out of the cockpit and quietly updated her about the boarding progress. "Almost done," the attendant said. The pilot nodded. "Good. We should be pushing back on time." Still, the memory kept tapping at the back of her thoughts like a quiet knock on a door. The Quiet Harbor. She had definitely heard that name before. After the last group of passengers boarded, the cabin door finally closed with a soft mechanical sound. The crew began their final safety checks while the aircraft prepared to leave the gate. The pilot stepped inside the cockpit and sat down in her seat. The co-pilot beside her reviewed the instrument panel while ground crew communicated through the headset. Outside, airport vehicles moved around the plane as the pushback process began. For a few minutes, the pilot focused entirely on the flight procedures. Her hands moved automatically over switches and controls as she confirmed each step with calm precision. Flying required attention. There was no room for distraction. Yet as the aircraft slowly rolled away from the gate, the title returned again. The Quiet Harbor. She frowned slightly. Why did that name feel so important? While the plane taxied toward the runway, she finally spoke. "Have you ever heard of a book called The Quiet Harbor?" she asked the co-pilot. He looked over briefly. "Sounds familiar," he said. "Isn't it some kind of survival story?" "I think so," she replied. He thought for a moment while adjusting a setting on the panel. "Yeah, wait. I remember now," he said slowly. "We talked about it during training years ago." The pilot turned slightly in her seat. "What do you remember about it?" "It was about a ship accident," he said. "A group of people stranded at sea during a storm." Pieces of the memory began sliding into place inside her mind. "Yes," she said quietly. "That's right." The co-pilot continued. The story was used in leadership training. Something about one person staying calm and organizing everyone while they waited for rescue. The pilot nodded slowly. Now she remembered more clearly. Years earlier, during one of her aviation leadership courses, the instructor had mentioned the book. It had been used as an example of how calm thinking and clear communication could save lives during a crisis. But there had been something unusual about it. The author's identity had never been revealed. The story had been published under a mysterious pen name. Millions of readers had been inspired by it, yet no one actually knew who wrote it. She leaned back slightly in her seat. "That's it," she said softly. The co-pilot glanced at her. "Why?" "Because one of the passengers is reading it," she replied. He shrugged casually. "Maybe they like survival stories." But the pilot didn't respond right away. Something about the situation felt odd. She remembered another detail now. The original copies of that book had become very rare over the years. Most people only read it online or through digital versions. Yet the man at the gate had been holding an old library copy. Not a new one, not a digital version. A worn physical book. The aircraft paused briefly in line behind other planes waiting for takeoff clearance. The pilot stared through the cockpit window at the runway lights glowing in the dark. Her mind continued replaying the moment at the gate. The quiet father, the sleeping child, the old book held carefully in his hands. Some books are worth carrying everywhere. His words echoed softly in her memory. The co-pilot finished another checklist. "Ready for departure," he said. "Ready," she confirmed. A moment later, the aircraft received permission to move onto the runway. The engines grew louder as the plane accelerated forward, gathering speed before lifting smoothly into the night sky. City lights stretched below them like golden threads across the darkness. Once the plane reached cruising altitude, the workload inside the cockpit became lighter. The pilot removed one hand from the controls and leaned back slightly. Now the thought returned again. The Quiet Harbor. She pulled out her phone during a quiet moment and quickly searched the title. Several articles appeared on the screen. She opened the first one. The page described the story behind the famous book. Years ago, a small research vessel had been caught in a violent ocean storm. The ship had suffered serious damage and eventually sank, leaving several passengers stranded in lifeboats far from shore. Rescue had taken more than a full day. According to the story, panic had nearly taken over the survivors, but one passenger had stayed calm. That person had organized a group, rationed supplies, and helped everyone stay focused until rescue teams finally arrived. The experience had later been written into a powerful memoir, The Quiet Harbor. The pilot scrolled through the articles slowly. The book had become widely known because of its emotional storytelling and powerful lessons about leadership during disaster. It had even been studied in some universities. Yet one detail still remained a mystery. The author had never revealed their real name. The article described the writer only as the survivor. The pilot stared at the screen for a moment. Something about the story now felt different. Earlier, she had only thought of the book as a famous title from training. But now she pictured the quiet father again. The man sitting calmly at gate 27. The worn library copy resting under his arm. The way he had spoken about it. Some books are worth carrying everywhere. Her curiosity began growing stronger. She wondered if the man even realized how famous that book had once been. Maybe he had simply picked it up from a library shelf without knowing its history. Or maybe he had read it many times before. The pilot set the phone down for a moment and looked out through the cockpit window again. The sky around them was peaceful and dark, dotted with distant stars. Inside the cabin behind them, passengers had settled into their seats. Some watched movies. Others slept. Somewhere back there, the quiet father and his daughter were probably sitting together. Maybe the girl was looking out the window. Maybe the father had already opened the book again. The pilot folded her arms thoughtfully. A strange feeling of curiosity stayed with her. There was nothing truly unusual about someone reading a book during a flight. Yet something about that particular book, in that man's hands, felt oddly personal. She couldn't explain why. Minutes passed quietly as the aircraft continued its smooth path through the night. Eventually, the pilot stood up from her seat. "I'm going to check the cabin," she said. The co-pilot nodded. "Everything's stable here." She stepped out of the cockpit and walked slowly down the aisle. Passengers barely noticed her as she passed. Soft lights glowed along the cabin ceiling. A few people were already asleep. Others watched movies through headphones. She moved carefully between the rows until she reached the middle section of the aircraft. Then she saw him. The quiet father sat beside the window. His daughter rested comfortably against his arm, hugging the stuffed rabbit, and the book was open again in his hands. The same worn library copy. The Quiet Harbor. He turned another page slowly. For a moment, the pilot simply stood there watching from a short distance. The cabin lights reflected softly on the pages. And for reasons she still couldn't fully explain, the sight made her feel unexpectedly curious. Because the man reading that book did not look like someone casually passing time on a flight. He looked like someone returning to a place he knew very well, a place that mattered. And that quiet thought followed her as she slowly continued walking down the aisle. The plane continued its steady flight above the dark landscape below. Soft humming of the engines filled the cabin. Passengers had mostly settled into a quiet rhythm. Some were watching movies. Others had closed their eyes to rest. The occasional murmur of conversation or laughter from children drifting through the aisles were the only sign of life besides the gentle movement of the flight attendants checking on travelers. The pilot, however, could not settle. Her mind was still on the quiet father from Gate 27. The worn library book he held, The Quiet Harbor, kept returning to her thoughts. There was something about the way he had handled it, the care with which he had turned each page. It wasn't just a reading habit. It was respect, something deeper. She remembered the small phrase he had said when she had teased him at the gate. Some books are worth carrying everywhere. Those words echoed in her mind. There had been a calmness in his voice, almost like a lesson spoken quietly to anyone who might be listening. There was a dignity to it, a quiet confidence that stood out sharply against the rush and chatter of the busy airport. As the flight settled into cruising altitude, she noticed a small detail she hadn't before. The way he had handled his daughter. Even though she was sleeping or fidgeting, he never let her feel unsafe or rushed. He adjusted her position gently, tucked the blanket over her shoulders, and even corrected the small fold of her stuffed rabbit's ears without making a sound. It was a careful attention that said more than words ever could. For a long moment, she thought about the book again. She pulled out her phone quietly, careful not to draw attention to herself. A quick search revealed more information than she had recalled earlier. The story behind The Quiet Harbor was fascinating. It detailed a storm at sea, a research vessel caught in violent waves, and passengers trapped for hours, struggling for survival. Panic had set in for many, but one person, unknown in the text, had organized a group, rationed supplies, and kept everyone alive until help arrived. The book had become famous for its lessons in leadership, courage, and calm thinking under pressure. Yet the identity of the survivor, the hero of the story, was never revealed. Everyone knew the tale, but no one knew the man behind it. And now, staring at the quiet father reading the same book, she couldn't help but feel a growing sense of recognition. Her curiosity got the better of her. She decided to approach the cabin again, this time with a different intent. She walked slowly down the aisle, not to announce anything, but to simply observe. Her steps were soft, careful not to disturb anyone who might be resting. When she reached the row where the father sat, she paused. He was still reading. His daughter had her eyes closed, hugging the rabbit tightly against her chest. The father's fingers traced the edges of the pages with care. There was something personal in the way he handled it, a sense of connection deeper than mere interest in a story. She noticed a small detail that she hadn't before. A thin piece of paper peeked from the pages of the book. It looked like a handwritten note. She couldn't read it from her spot in the aisle, but the presence of it sparked a sudden recognition in her mind. Whoever had written the note, it was meant for someone specific, and it was important enough to keep inside the worn pages. For a long moment, she just watched. The man was quiet, calm, and utterly unaware of the scrutiny around him. The plane hummed steadily. The passengers remained absorbed in their activities. And yet this one small scene felt completely separate from the ordinary rhythm of the flight. It felt like a pause in time. Her thoughts returned to the original story of the book. The mysterious survivor, the person who had remained composed during a life-threatening storm, had acted without thought of recognition or reward. The pilot realized she was staring at a man who, perhaps, had lived that story himself. Her pulse quickened slightly. Could it be possible? Could this quiet, unassuming man really be the person who had inspired countless readers with tales of courage and calm in the face of disaster? The idea seemed improbable. Yet, something in his calm demeanor, the careful attention to his child, and the reverence for the book suggested a deeper truth. The flight attendants moved past her, checking on passengers and offering water. She stepped back slightly, not wanting to draw attention, and continued to watch. Every now and then, the father adjusted his daughter's blanket, read another page, or looked out the window briefly. There was no hint of pride, no sign of wanting recognition. He simply existed in the moment, living it quietly and fully. She couldn't resist any longer. Slowly, she approached closer, standing near the aisle just a few steps from his seat. The soft light from the overhead lamps illuminated the pages of the book and the gentle expression on the father's face. It was then that something extraordinary happened. As he turned a page, the note tucked inside the book slipped slightly, revealing a few words written in careful, looping handwriting. Her eyes caught the name on it. Daniel Harper. Her breath caught. Daniel Harper. That name was familiar from articles, from news reports, from the stories she had read in her training years ago. Daniel Harper was the survivor, the quiet hero, the person behind the quiet harbor. For a moment, she could not speak. Her mind raced, trying to comprehend what she was seeing. The man she had casually teased at the gate, mocked even, in her own mind for reading a library book, was the very person who had lived one of the most inspiring survival stories of recent decades. She watched as he gently closed the book and slid the note back between the pages. He made no effort to draw attention to it. There was no proud gesture, no story to tell. He simply adjusted his daughter's blanket and held her hand lightly, letting her rest. The pilot felt a mix of awe and humility. Here was someone who had faced the unimaginable, kept calm, guided others to safety, and never sought recognition. He lived quietly, chose anonymity, and yet his story had changed countless lives through the book he inspired. Her heart beat faster. She had never expected to encounter the person behind the legend in such an ordinary setting, among ordinary travelers. Yet here he was, reading a worn library copy of his own story, gently caring for his daughter, and completely unaware of the realization dawning on her. Time seemed to slow. The hum of the engines, the soft breathing of passengers, the distant glow of city lights beneath the plane, all of it faded into the background. There was only him, only the quiet hero living quietly, and only the small, powerful presence of the story in her mind. She took a deep breath and decided she had to know. The moment was delicate. She needed to approach with care, with respect, with the understanding that this man had survived more than anyone could imagine and chose to live without recognition. "Excuse me," she said softly, careful not to startle him. The father looked up slowly, his calm eyes meeting hers. "Yes?" he said, his voice gentle. She swallowed. "Did you live the story?" For a brief moment, he looked down at the book, then back at his daughter, then finally at her. A small, almost imperceptible smile appeared on his face. "Yes," he said quietly. "I did." The pilot felt a wave of emotion she could not contain. Respect, awe, and a deep sense of humility washed over her. She realized that the quietest man on the plane, the one who had gone unnoticed by nearly everyone, had survived a storm, saved lives, and remained entirely anonymous for years. The child stirred in his lap. He adjusted her position again, not letting the moment break the calm atmosphere he carried. The pilot stepped back slightly, allowing them to remain in their space, feeling grateful for witnessing this quiet truth. She understood, in that moment, that true courage often comes without recognition, that heroes don't always need applause, and sometimes the most remarkable people live their lives quietly, leaving a legacy through actions rather than words. And she knew that she would never forget this flight, The Quiet Father, and the Warren Library book that had revealed so much more than any headline or story ever could. For the rest of the flight, she kept glancing back at him, each time reminded that the ordinary can hold extraordinary truths, and that sometimes the quietest people carry the heaviest, most inspiring stories in their hearts. The aircraft continued to glide smoothly through the night sky. The soft hum of the engines created a rhythm that seemed almost meditative. Passengers were either quietly watching movies, reading, or napping, and the cabin lights glowed dimly, creating a calm atmosphere. The pilot returned to her seat after checking the cabin. She couldn't stop thinking about the man sitting just a few rows behind her, Daniel Harper. The realization that the Quiet Father was the person behind the Quiet Harbor filled her with awe. She tried to focus on the flight instruments, but her mind kept replaying every detail from earlier: the Warren Library book, the careful way he held it, the note tucked between the pages, and most of all, the calm and gentle way he cared for his daughter. She thought about the story of the storm at sea, the hours of panic, the struggle to survive, and the man who kept everyone alive with nothing but patience and courage. That man had faced the unimaginable and had never sought recognition. And now, here he was, sitting quietly in economy class, reading the very story of his life as if it were just another book on the shelf. Her co-pilot noticed her quiet gaze and followed it to the row behind them. "You're staring," he said softly, almost smiling. She shook her head. I think I know who that is." He raised an eyebrow. "Who?" She took a slow breath. "The man behind the Quiet Harbor." The co-pilot leaned slightly closer. "Wait, you mean the survivor story from the storm years ago?" "Yes," she said, her voice almost a whisper. "I think he's right there." The co-pilot glanced back, then nodded slowly, a mix of curiosity and disbelief on his face. "Well, that's something you don't see every day." She returned her focus to him. Daniel sat by the window, gently adjusting his daughter's blanket, holding the stuffed rabbit in her arms, and turning another page of the Warren Library book. It was as if the chaos of the airport, the excitement of boarding, and the hum of the aircraft had never existed for him. He existed in his own quiet world, peaceful and composed. For a long moment, she watched him, and a strange feeling settled over her. A mix of humility, admiration, and awe. He didn't act like a hero. He didn't demand attention or acknowledgement. He simply lived his life quietly with dignity and care, teaching lessons through action rather than words. The pilot thought about her own life, about the countless times she had faced challenges in her career. The storms she had encountered were nothing compared to what he had survived, and yet he had done it without a single word to claim glory. She realized that bravery often came without applause, that leadership could exist in silence, and that true heroes could live among ordinary people without anyone noticing. She glanced back at him again. Daniel carefully closed the book for a moment, as if savoring a memory or a thought. Then he opened again, turning to the next page with the same calm precision. His daughter stirred, rubbing her eyes sleepily, and he adjusted her head gently on his shoulder. The softness of the moment was almost striking in contrast to the magnitude of the story she now knew he had lived. The pilot leaned back in her seat, her mind racing. How many people had been inspired by his story without ever knowing who he was? How many had learned lessons about courage, patience, and leadership from his experiences? And yet here he was, reading quietly, completely removed from the fame or recognition that could have followed him. She felt a sudden urge to speak to him again, but she hesitated. This was not a moment for questions or for revealing her knowledge. This was a moment to simply observe, to appreciate the quiet strength of a man who had changed so many lives without seeking credit. Minutes passed, and she found herself occasionally glancing back at him. He remained patient, composed, and entirely selfless in his attention to his daughter. The book rested lightly under his arm when he wasn't reading, and the note inside seemed like a secret bridge connecting the story of his past with the quiet present of this flight. The pilot thought about the meaning of courage. She had faced difficult situations, made quick decisions in emergencies, and been responsible for hundreds of lives at once. But the courage Daniel had shown, calm, measured, and enduring, was of a different kind. It was quiet, personal, and infinite in patience. It was a courage that changed outcomes without spectacle, without recognition, and without applause. She found herself inspired in a way she had not expected. Her thoughts wandered beyond the flight, imagining the impact of someone like Daniel living quietly among ordinary people. How many others could there be like him, living incredible lives without anyone realizing it? How many untold stories existed quietly behind ordinary appearances? The plane hummed steadily, gliding through the night sky. She looked at the city lights far below, stretching endlessly, and felt a sense of perspective. Life was full of quiet moments, small gestures, and unnoticed acts of bravery. Daniel Harper embodied all of it. He had survived, saved lives, and yet he was content to sit quietly with his daughter, a library book resting under his arm, leaving the world to discover his story through the pages rather than through himself. The pilot's gaze lingered on him a little longer. She noticed a small smile he gave his daughter when she woke slightly to look out the window. The simplicity of that gesture, the tenderness, the care, felt profound in its own way. It was a reminder that heroism could exist in everyday moments as much as it did in extraordinary circumstances. For the rest of the flight, she kept stealing glances at him, careful not to intrude, but unwilling to let the moment pass unnoticed. Every time she saw him, she was reminded of the lessons the book had taught so many people, now embodied in the quiet man who had lived it. When it was almost time to begin the descent, she took one last look at him. Daniel Harper gently closed the book, slipped it under his arm, and held his daughter's hand. She watched as he adjusted her seatbelt carefully and made sure she was comfortable. There was no boastfulness, no attempt to seek attention, only care, calmness, and quiet strength. The pilot felt a deep respect for him, realizing that some of the greatest lessons in life came not from stories read on a page, but from witnessing the actions of those who lived them. She understood that Daniel Harper had not just survived a storm at sea. He had embodied resilience, leadership, and selflessness in the purest form, and he continued to embody it in the ordinary moments of his daily life. As the aircraft began its final approach, she reflected on the extraordinary truth she had witnessed. The quiet father with the library book had become, in that short flight, a living lesson in courage, humility, and the power of silent heroism. And though the passengers around her were unaware, she knew that meeting him, even from a distance, had changed her perspective forever. It was a reminder that true strength often spoke in whispers, and that some of the most remarkable people in the world never asked to be recognized for the lives they touched. The plane descended smoothly, lights of the city spreading beneath them like a golden quilt. She took a deep breath, grateful for the quiet lessons of the man behind the quiet harbor, and for the chance to witness a living example of courage and quiet leadership that words alone could never fully capture. Even as the wheels touched down and the passengers prepared to disembark, the image of Daniel Harper sitting quietly with his daughter, book in hand, stayed with her, a silent hero living among ordinary people, teaching lessons through presence, care, and humility, without ever needing the world to know his name. The plane touched down smoothly, the wheels making contact with the runway, with a quiet thud. The cabin lights brightened slowly as the aircraft taxied toward the gate. Passengers began shifting in their seats, gathering belongings and preparing to leave. The soft hum of conversation rose as people stretched and yawned, eager to continue with their journeys. The pilot stayed in her seat a moment longer, reflecting on the flight and on the quiet father she had come to know from a distance. Daniel Harper, the man who had lived the story behind a quiet harbor without ever seeking recognition. She felt a deep respect for him, a sense of humility she had not expected when she first noticed him at the gate. As the plane reached the gate and the seatbelt signs turned off, passengers slowly began to rise. Some exchanged polite nods with flight attendants. Others rushed ahead to catch connecting flights or to meet waiting rides. Daniel carefully stood with his daughter, who still held her stuffed rabbit tightly in her arms. He adjusted the bag over his shoulder, making sure his daughter's coat was zipped, and walked toward the aisle with quiet purpose. The pilot watched him from her cockpit. She noticed the way he moved, calmly, deliberately, and without hurry. He did not seem like someone who wanted attention or admiration. He simply existed in the moment, attending to his child, moving through the busy cabin as if it were a quiet, private space. The co-pilot noticed her gaze. "You still looking?" he asked with a small grin. "Yes," she admitted softly. "I can't help it. There's something about him. Something extraordinary." The co-pilot raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "Extraordinary?" She nodded. "Yes, he's the person from the quiet harbor. I saw it in him. The calm, the care, the way he handles every small thing with patience. That's the man who survived the storm. That's the man who led everyone to safety. Right there, quietly living among us." He looked back at the row where Daniel had been sitting, now mostly empty as passengers moved forward. "Wow," he said quietly. "You don't see that every day." The pilot took a deep breath and leaned back in her seat. She thought about the story of the storm, about the hours of uncertainty, the fear, and the courage it took to guide others through danger. And then she thought about the quiet way Daniel lived his life now. There were no grand gestures, no interviews, no public recognition, just quiet strength, gentle care, and the presence of a man who had learned the value of patience, resilience, and humility. Passengers began standing in the aisle, moving toward the exit doors. Daniel carefully held his daughter's hand, making sure she stayed close. She looked up at him with tired eyes, and he smiled softly, kneeling slightly to adjust the strap of her backpack. The tenderness of that moment was almost sacred. The pilot watched as he approached the doorway of the plane. She realized that the lesson of this flight was not about survival at sea or heroic deeds in dramatic moments. It was about living with quiet integrity, about teaching through presence, about showing courage in small, consistent ways. Every act of care, every gentle word, every decision made with thoughtfulness, those were the real measures of heroism. She felt a sudden urge to speak to him one last time, to acknowledge the respect she had developed for him. Carefully, she stood and moved down the aisle, avoiding the attention of passengers bustling past. She stopped a few rows behind Daniel as he prepared to step onto the jet bridge. "Excuse me," she said softly. Daniel turned his head, calm and attentive, his eyes meeting hers. "Yes." She hesitated for a moment, choosing her words carefully. I wanted to say thank you. Not for the book, not for the story, but for everything you've shown, even quietly. The courage, the care, the patience, it's inspiring." His lips curved into a small, gentle smile. "Thank you," he said simply. "But there's nothing to thank me for. I just did what I could when it was needed. That's all." The pilot nodded, understanding fully. This was the essence of his character. Humility, dignity, and the refusal to seek praise for actions done out of necessity or compassion. The small girl tugged lightly on his hand, signaling she was ready to move. He knelt again, adjusting the coat over her shoulders, and then took her hand, walking toward the door. The pilot watched as he disappeared into the jet bridge, his daughter's hand in his, the stuffed rabbit tucked under her arm. She returned to her seat, leaning back with a deep exhale. The realization of what she had witnessed settled over her. This was a lesson she would carry long after the flight ended. Heroism could exist in silence. Leadership could exist without recognition. And some of the most extraordinary people might live ordinary lives among us, quietly shaping the world in ways no one else could see. The rest of the passengers filed off the plane. The pilot remained in her seat, allowing the cabin empty while reflecting on the quiet moments that defined Daniel Harper. His story, both lived and written, had touched countless people, but the man himself moved through life with the same calm dignity that saved lives years ago. She thought about the impact of witnessing such quiet courage firsthand. It reminded her that heroism was not measured by applause or fame, but by the choices made when no one is watching. The careful attention to another person's safety, the willingness to act without reward, and the quiet strength to live with integrity. Those were qualities that made someone truly remarkable. As the last passenger stepped off the plane and the cabin emptied, the pilot looked out at the runway lights fading into the distance. She thought about Daniel Harper walking through the airport, holding his daughter's hand, carrying the lessons of the past quietly into every moment of the present. It was a reminder that extraordinary lives often hide behind ordinary appearances, that the quietest person in a room could hold more strength and wisdom than anyone else, and that the world sometimes only glimpses greatness in the unlikeliest of places, through small gestures and silent actions. The pilot returned to the cockpit, feeling a sense of calm and inspiration. She knew that the memory of this flight, the quiet father, the library book, the small girl, and the silent heroism, would stay with her for a long time. It was a lesson in humility, patience, and courage that no report, story, or book could fully convey. As the engines powered down, and the plane came to a complete stop at the gate, she took one last thought of Daniel Harper. In a world that often seeks recognition, he had lived a life of quiet purpose, teaching lessons not with words or fame, but through every small, thoughtful action. And as the doors opened and the final passenger stepped off, she realized that some heroes are never celebrated. They are remembered not for the attention they receive, but for the quiet strength they show every day, in every ordinary moment. And sometimes, encountering such a person, even briefly, changes the way you see the world forever. Daniel Harper and his daughter disappeared into the terminal crowd, carrying with them the quiet power of a story lived, the lessons of courage and care, and the simple truth that real heroism often speaks softly and walks among us unnoticed, waiting for someone to recognize it in the smallest of moments. The pilot leaned back, closed her eyes for a moment, feeling humbled, inspired, and grateful for the chance to witness a quiet life that had spoken louder than any words ever could.